right, diving in today, getting right into it. Practical Kung Fu Street Defense.
Oh.
This is by Wei-Sin Johnny Sai.
Mm.
And, you guys have been asking for, self-defense, like real, when things get rough, what do you do? No, not the movie stuff.
Yeah, not the flashy stuff.
Not the flashy stuff, exactly. So we're going to pull out the core principles, the techniques that Sai presents, and really try to drill down into what's going to give you, the tools, the actionable steps to keep yourself safe.
Yeah, right off the bat, the thing that grabs you about this book is it's so no nonsense. It's not about a big drawn out fight. It's really about stopping an attacker, and ideally in 5 moves or less. Now, while it is built on traditional kung fu, he is very much focused on real street confrontations, the messy, unpredictable nature of it all. It's really about simplicity and effectiveness. So it doesn't matter if you've never done any martial arts or you've been doing it for years, there's something in here for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought, even the forewords to the book really kind of underscore that. You've got Keith Hackney, who was in the early UFC, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Talks about, even with his MMA background, he found a lot of value in, these almost fundamental techniques. He even talks about using a palm strike based on these principles in the octagon.
Wow.
And then you've got Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr., who is a student of Sai's, and he really hits hard on the ugly practical side of kung fu fighting, right? The stuff that actually works when it matters, not the pretty stuff.
No, not the pretty stuff, but the effective stuff.
Right, exactly.
That's such an important distinction, and Jackson Jr. actually says it, no flippin' animal style or acrobatic jumping, really emphasizing that this is pragmatic, learnable self-defense.
Right.
He even says that someone who has never done martial arts might see these techniques and think, hey, I could do that. And that seems to be exactly what Sai's going for.
Yeah, and that kind of, ties into our mission for this deep dive, right?
Mm.
We're gonna start with these foundational principles, the bedrock of Sai's approach. So like how to stand, which is it's more involved than it sounds.
Yeah, it really is.
And then we'll look at angles, how understanding angles in a confrontation can really it can surprise you how much of an advantage that can be.
Oh yeah, huge advantage.
Right. And then understanding different combat ranges.
Yeah.
So like how far away you are from someone, that dictates what you should be doing.
Yeah, completely changes things.
Totally. And then this idea of tells, or what Sai calls telegraphs.
Yeah.
These are like almost subconscious movements, someone might make right before they strike.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And learning how to spot those in someone else, but also, just as importantly, making sure you're not telegraphing your own moves, that can be huge.
Huh.
And of course, we'll look at the actual techniques, the strikes themselves. Yeah. So we'll look at different hand strikes, like the straight punch, the back fist, all that stuff, all that cool stuff. Leg techniques as well, really focusing on how to use like the denser parts of your limbs.
Yeah,
right?
for maximum effect.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And it's not just about offense,
right?
We're also going to cover defense.
Yeah.
How to evade a strike completely, how to parry, kind of deflect an incoming attack.
Yeah.
And then how to use blocks as that like last safeguard.
And then finally, that warrior mentality. I love how Sai emphasizes that.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about the moves. It's about that mental preparedness.
Exactly.
That allows you to use them effectively.
Totally, totally. Now, before we get into all that, let's just give a little background on Wei-Sin Johnny Sai.
Yeah.
He started training in Kung Fu early, like 8 years old, under his father, who was Grandmaster John Chi Yuan Sai. He also trained under Grandmaster Stephen G. Abate.
So he's got this incredible lineage. He's also the chief U.S. representative for the Sai family Shaolin Chuanfa Kung Fu system.
Wow.
And he's an 8th degree black sash in multiple disciplines. So this is a guy who really knows his stuff.
Yeah, this isn't just theoretical book knowledge.
Yeah.
He's got that lived experience. And, it's not even just in the dojo, right? He's been involved in martial arts committees. And one thing that really stood out to me from the book is he mentions these techniques. They've been used in seminars, and they've been taught to law enforcement, FBI agents, but also everyday people.
Wow.
So that suggests that this isn't just some esoteric theoretical stuff. Like this is actually being used.
Yeah, it's battle tested. So let's get into these core concepts. Let's talk about the basics. So Sai says that stance work is fundamental.
Yeah.
Why is that so crucial for practical self-defense?
Well, he uses this analogy, right? Like a strong house needs a strong foundation. That's what stance work is. It's about developing that ability to root yourself.
Right.
Yeah. So someone can't just push you over and knock you off balance. But it also goes the other way. Like a solid stance can actually allow you to uproot your attacker.
Oh, I see. So it's about both stability and power.
Exactly. Exactly. And one thing he hits on right away is you should never just stand still, in the line of attack.
Seems kind of obvious, but I guess it's easy to freeze up under pressure.
Oh, for sure. But he just keeps coming back to this principle of movement.
Why is that so important, that constant emphasis on movement?
Well, because movement creates opportunity, right?
Okay.
So if someone throws a punch, a kick, and they miss because you've moved, they're momentarily off balance.
Hmm.
And Sai says you need to use those precious seconds, right,
Yeah.
to your advantage. Counter with enough force that you can stun them and disable them.
Okay.
And then the power for both blocking and striking, he says, it comes from the ground up. It's generated by your legs.
That makes sense.
Now he gets into specific stances, starting with the traditional Kung Fu horse stance.
Okay, so what are the key elements of that one, and what does it help you develop?
So the horse stance is, you're standing with your feet about shoulder width apart, maybe a little wider, knees bent, like directly over your ankles,
Mm-hmm.
and your feet are pointing straight ahead. And ideally, your thighs are parallel to the ground.
Wow.
You want your weight centered or slightly towards your heels, back straight.
Yeah.
He says, if you even just hold this position right for a minute,
Mm-hmm.
you really feel the leg strength it builds,
Yeah, I bet.
but also the hip flexibility, the lower leg flexibility.
Mm.
It just teaches you how to really use your body properly.
Right.
And one thing that's really cool about the horse stance is that low center of gravity. It not only gives you that stability, but it makes it really hard for an attacker to take you down quickly.
Which is essential in a street fight.
Oh, totally. Especially
Yeah.
if there's more than one attacker.
Right.
You don't want to be wrestling on the ground.
Definitely not.
And he actually gives some practical ways to kind of understand this, right? Like have a friend try to push you from the side when you're just standing relaxed versus when you're in a horse stance.
Right.
Huge difference.
I bet.
He also says, play around with dropping into horse stance naturally and feel how it roots you against those side attacks, even against being grabbed like in a bear hug from behind.
So if someone comes up behind you.
Yeah. He even says, this is a little trick. You can actually hook one of your feet behind the attacker's leg if they're trying to lift you up. It gives you even more stability.
Wow, that's a good tip.
Yeah. Then we've got the bow and arrow stance.
So how is that different from the horse stance, and what are the main benefits there?
So the bow and arrow stance, it's a longer stance. Your heels are roughly in line, but your toes are angled out about 45 degrees to one side. Your front leg's bent, knee over the ankle, thigh parallel to the floor, but your back leg is straight
Okay.
and your hip is rotated towards the ground. Weight distribution, way more on the front leg, like 70%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it also builds, leg strength, hip, leg flexibility. But this one's really about moving forward powerfully,
Mm-hmm.
staying balanced, and learning how to generate thrust from your back leg. Like it's a stance that prepares you to launch forward or to absorb incoming force.
Right.
And he actually ties this directly to getting out of the way of forward attacks.
Mm-hmm.
He even says, have someone like gently push at your shoulders while you're in the stance and just kind of feel how it helps you absorb a blow.
Interesting.
Yeah. But then he really quickly transitions into using the bow and arrow stance to actively evade forward attacks.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where it gets cool, right? The drill he describes is like someone's going to push at you and you step to an angle
Yeah.
while simultaneously going into a bow stance, which takes you completely out of the line of attack.
Oh, smart.
Right.
Yeah.
And he highlights that this stance trains you to spring off that back leg, either to create distance or to close the distance rapidly to counter. And importantly, right, he immediately links this movement to blocking. He says, by doing this, you've learned the first two crucial rules of Kung Fu street defense: move and block.
So it's not just about standing there and taking it.
Right.
You're always moving, always adapting.
Exactly.
Okay, so then there's the cat stance. That one sounds a little bit more specialized.
It is. The cat stance also starts with a wider stance, rotated toes,
Mhm.
but the weight distribution is really dramatic here. It's 90% of your weight on one bent leg.
Wow.
The other leg is bent, heel lifted, only the ball of the foot is touching, and that's only carrying like 10% of your weight.
So most of your weight is on that one leg.
Yeah, yeah. And this one, it builds leg strength, hip flexibility, but it's really about teaching you to load that one leg while maintaining balance
Mm,
and developing this really explosive thrust from that loaded back leg, like for kicks.
that makes sense.
And it also enhances your balance both for evasion and kicking. Like think of it like a coiled spring, ready to release.
Right.
And he says it's not as dynamically forward moving as the bow and arrow stance, but it offers a different kind of advantage. It's almost like a more reactive
Or reactive.
advantage.
Okay, so like a counterattack kind of stance.
Yeah, and he actually compares it to a cat,
Yep.
that agility, the stealth, and he emphasizes how subtly you can turn your waist to deflect a blow,
Mm,
right? Just rotate your core out of the direct line of attack.
got it.
It keeps your other leg free for quick kicks, knee
Yeah.
strikes, while maintaining your overall balance and power. And the drill he suggests is practice stepping into the cat stance at even the slightest touch.
So you're training your body to react instantly,
Yeah, like you're training that instant reaction to get out of harm's way.
but without giving your move away too early.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got these traditional stances. They're exercises for developing your skill. But then he moves on to what he calls natural stances for immediate application.
Right, right. So these are the ones you would actually use if you were in a real-world situation.
Got it. So the first one is the passive defensive stance.
Okay, so what does that one look like?
So this is a much more relaxed, natural-looking stance. Your feet are about shoulder width apart, legs are slightly bent, your hands are held loosely in front of you. One may be a little further forward than the other, with your palms kind of facing outward and slightly down, your fingers relaxed but together.
So it's not aggressive looking.
No, it's not confrontational, but Sai points out if you sense someone intending to violate your personal space, your hands are already halfway to where they can protect you.
So it's like you're setting this subtle boundary.
Exactly.
Okay.
It promotes even weight distribution, encourages good eye contact, it allows you to react quicker if needed, but without unnecessarily escalating things.
So you're not like squaring off against someone.
Right, you're just being aware.
Yeah, you're just aware, kind of keeping your guard up subtly.
Yeah, okay. And then the second natural stance is the fighting cat stance. So how does this one differ from the traditional cat stance that we talked about earlier?
So the fighting cat stance, your feet are roughly in line with your shoulders, one foot slightly forward, the other back. But your weight, again, 80–90%, is on the back leg.
Okay.
And your hands are held in front of your chest, one slightly ahead of the other.
Mm,
They can be in loose fists, fingers together, thumbs tucked. It's kind of this ready position that allows you to step or root yourself, much like those traditional stances, but it's really designed to be more adaptable to a sudden threat.
Oh, okay. So it's more instantly combat ready compared to the passive defensive stance.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
From here, you can easily root yourself by distributing your weight, spring to an angle to avoid those straight line attacks, shift your way back to counter, step to the side to root, and turn your core out of danger. And Tsai even suggests having, friends approach you from different angles
Oh,
while you're in this stance
right.
to really reinforce those principles of constant movement and effective countering.
Yeah, makes sense. So we've got our stances down. Now we can move on to the concept of angles,
Right,
which is basically the idea of not being a static target in a straight line.
exactly. Tsai explains that our natural reaction, right, is to move, straight forward or straight backwards when we're facing a threat. But moving to the side, working the angles, is generally a much safer and more advantageous approach.
Okay.
So if an attacker comes straight in, moving to an angle puts you in their open area, maybe even their blind spot,
Right.
making your counterattack way more effective. And it also might give you a clearer path to escape, to end the confrontation.
So it's about creating space and opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. And he gives some really specific examples of how those different stances we talked about can be used, in combination with these angles.
Right.
He talks about how the horse stance can be used for side-to-side attacks and defenses, the bow and arrow for moving to and attacking from those upper left and right corners, laterally.
Right.
And then the cat stance for moving to that left rear corner and then countering toward the upper right. It's really cool how your stance influences your ability to use these angles effectively.
So it all ties together. It's a system.
It does, yeah.
Mhm.
And the last fundamental principle he brings up in this first chapter is combat ranges. This is all about knowing how to adapt your techniques based on how close you are to an attacker. He breaks it down into 4 distinct ranges.
Okay, so let's start with range #1.
All right, range #1, long to intermediate distance. So basically, at the furthest end of this range, you and your opponent are far enough apart that even a fully expanded leg wouldn't make contact.
Okay.
As soon as one of you takes a step in with a kick, or you get close enough that you could attempt a strike with a fully extended punch, you've entered the intermediate distance of this range. So you're within each other's personal zones, but you're not right on top of each other.
Okay.
Defensively, this range offers the most options. All
Is
right.
her vision.
Yeah. You've got space to bob,
Yeah.
weave, maneuver, stay out of the way before a strike can land. Offensively, you can use longer punches and kicks. You can get that full extension,
Right.
hit, and then move out of range.
So there's more room to maneuver.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, range #2 is short distance. So what happens when you close that initial gap?
Okay, so what happens in range #2?
So you're inside your opponent's fully extended limbs, essentially.
Okay.
So longer strikes, they're not as effective here. You really want to be using shorter, more compact techniques like tight hook punches, uppercuts, elbows, knees. That's your bread and butter in this range.
Right.
Defensively, it gets trickier because you got less time to react right away.
Definitely.
So you really need to be on top of guarding your vital areas. However, he points out that being in this short range can actually be an advantage if your attacker has a long weapon, like a club, a bat.
Ah, because you can get inside their reach?
Yeah, you can jam their reach, make the weapon less useful.
Makes sense.
Offensively, yeah, it's harder to disengage quickly in this range, but you're also much closer to those vital striking targets.
Right. Eyes, nose, throat.
Exactly. So accurate, targeted strikes can be really effective here.
So it's a trade-off, higher risk, higher reward.
Totally. Then we get to range #3, no distance.
Okay, this is where it gets up close and personal.
Yeah, at this point, you're basically right on top of each other, in contact or near contact, but you're both still standing.
Right.
This is where grappling comes in.
So joint manipulation, grabs, holds, throws, sweeps, all that stuff.
Yeah. And defensively, the big things to worry about here are being choked, obviously, because that restricts oxygen to your brain, and then being swept or thrown to the ground, which puts you in a vulnerable position.
Especially if there's more than one attacker, as you said before.
Exactly. Exactly. Now, offensively, your advantages in this range, it often comes down to having a better root, a better sense of your own center of gravity, and a really good understanding of angles in close quarters.
Right, all things that are developed through that stance work.
Exactly. And finally, we have range #4, which is ground fighting.
So that's when things go down to the mat.
Yeah. And, this involves joint locks, holds, submissions, all while you're on the ground. Defensively, leverage is huge, right?
Absolutely.
And understanding how to use your body weight effectively to escape those pins and submissions. You also need to be aware that if your opponent is significantly heavier,
Yeah.
they have a big advantage. Offensively, success here is all about a really deep understanding of body mechanics, limb range of motion, applying pressure to those vulnerable joints. But Tsai makes a really, really important point here.
Okay.
While training in grappling is super important to becoming a well-rounded martial artist, in a real street fight where there could be multiple attackers or weapons, your main goal should always be to get back on your feet.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right. He even specifically says to avoid ground fighting if you think your attacker has a knife.
Yeah.
Because you're just putting yourself at huge risk of being cut.
In a vulnerable position.
Yeah.
So the big takeaway here is that understanding the distance between you and an attacker is essential
Totally.
in determining your most effective response.
It's fundamental, right? Being aware of these different ranges, it gives you that tactical advantage.
Absolutely.
All right, let's move on to chapter 2, the telegraph. Tsai starts this chapter by saying, the telegraph is the movement, the twitch, or expression created before a fighter attacks.
Okay, so why is it so vital to understand and read these telegraphs?
Because in a physical confrontation, even a fraction of a second can make a huge difference.
Right.
And being able to recognize those telegraphs in your attacker, those subtle unconscious movements they make before they strike, can give you that extra split second to react, to evade or even to launch a preemptive counter. Conversely, if you can minimize your own telegraphs, you prevent your opponent from anticipating what you're going to do.
So you have the element of surprise.
Exactly. And this isn't just about, winning a fight. This could be the difference between getting hurt and staying safe.
Right, avoiding harm altogether.
Totally.
So he breaks down dealing with telegraphs into two components.
Right.
Being able to read your opponent's telegraphs and being able to minimize your own.
Right.
So let's start with how we can learn to read an attacker's movements. What are some of the things that we should be looking for in their body language?
So he talks about both physical tension in the body and then subtle changes in facial expressions,
Okay.
like primary indicators.
Okay.
So body tension, it might be as small as a slight lifting of a shoulder,
Mm-hmm.
like a subtle cocking of an arm, or even just a tiny flinch of the torso as their body gets ready to, unleash energy. Now, Facial expressions can be particularly revealing because they're often involuntary, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he says to look for things like a tightening or grimacing around the eyebrows, a sudden widening of the eyes right before an attack, a pursing or tightening of the lips.
Mm.
And Sai points out that just as certain facial expressions are associated with happiness or sadness, right,
Yeah.
there are similar involuntary facial cues that precede an aggressive action.
So it's about learning to read those subtle signs.
Exactly. And he gives some really practical exercises for developing
Oh,
this.
okay. What kind of exercises?
So he calls it you on you practice, where you're basically standing in front of a mirror and intentionally performing various strikes from different stances. And you're really just watching yourself
Okay.
to become aware of what your own body, your face is doing in those moments leading up to the strike. So then you can better recognize them in someone else.
Mm-hmm.
He also has one-on-one practice where you're observing a partner as they kind of simulate attacks at a safe distance at first, and then gradually getting closer, incorporating movement. And this helps you to distinguish between like the obvious big telegraphs and those more subtle, harder to detect ones.
Right. So you can pick up on those subtle cues even when things are happening quickly.
Exactly. And, the ultimate goal of being able to read these pre-attack signals is to train your reflexes to the point where your response becomes almost instinctive.
Right. Like you react without even thinking about it.
Exactly. And with consistent practice, your reflexes and your awareness just become so much sharper. Ideally, your autonomic nervous system will start reacting to those potential threats even before your conscious mind has fully processed it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like you get this gut feeling that something's about to happen.
Like Spider-Man's Spidey sense.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about minimizing our own telegraphs.
Right. The other side of the coin.
Why is it so important to make sure we're not giving away our intentions before we act?
Well, because telegraphing your moves is like announcing your attack in advance.
Right.
You're giving your opponent time to get ready to defend or even to launch a counter of their own.
Right, right.
And by minimizing your tells, you can strike when they're least expecting it and they're not braced for impact, which just makes your techniques way more effective.
And Sai says it's like slipping a punch in before your opponent even sees it coming.
Exactly.
Okay, so how can we practice minimizing our own telegraphs?
So again, he recommends that you on you mirror practice, but this time you're really focusing on trying to maintain a neutral expression like a poker face while you execute those strikes.
Okay.
And he even suggests trying to smile or talk while you're throwing punches.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And really concentrate on keeping your shoulders, your whole body relaxed, avoiding that tendency to stare at the target.
Right, because that's a dead giveaway.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
it is.
So the goal is to be as deceptive as possible while still being effective.
Exactly, exactly.
Hmm.
And for one-on-one practice, he suggests doing these light contact drills with a partner using open, relaxed palms from those different stances and hand positions.
Yeah.
And he even says, adopt casual postures, like gesturing while you're talking.
Okay.
And this helps you become comfortable with initiating a strike without tensing up beforehand.
Yeah, because if you're tense, that's a telegraph.
Oh, totally.
Okay, so mastering the art of the telegraph, it sounds like it's a really crucial element of self-defense.
It is. It adds this psychological dimension, on top of those physical techniques.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 3, stun, crippling, and knockout shots.
Right. And these are terms that suggest different levels of force, different outcomes.
Right.
And Sai's very clear that the amount of force you use should always be appropriate to the situation. He cautions against thinking there's some magic technique that'll instantly neutralize any threat.
Real-world self-defense is rarely that clean.
Right. He even says it can be dirty and ugly, and that your main objective is always to stop the threat, make sure you survive.
Right.
But he also frames these different types of shots as a way to counter an attacker who's already put your life at risk.
Okay, so he then talks about your arsenal, primarily your hands and feet.
Right.
But he also stresses the importance of proper hand and foot positioning.
Oh, absolutely. Because you don't want to injure yourself while you're striking.
Definitely not. Okay, so he goes into some basic hand techniques.
Yeah, he gives these really clear overviews. So we've got things like the 4-fist strike, which is your standard straight punch with a rotation of the fist. The vertical punch, which is straight on but with the thumb up. The back fist, which is that arching punch from your guard that relies more on speed than a big windup.
Okay.
The hammer fist, where you're striking with the bottom of your fist like a hammer. You could do it in a downward motion or arching. The knife hand, where you're using that rigid edge of your hand below the pinky. The spear hand, which is a straight thrust with your fingertips.
Okay.
And he's very careful to say this should only be used in extreme circumstances,
Right.
because it's so dangerous.
Yeah.
Um, he even says to only use this if you're targeting the eyes or the throat because of the risk of injury.
Right. Makes sense.
And then you've got the tiger's mouth, which uses that reinforced area between your thumb and index finger,
Yeah.
again, for strikes to the throat.
Yeah.
But again, he's like, this is super dangerous.
Yeah, you could really hurt someone with that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And then finally, there's the elbow strike.
Okay, yeah, those are effective.
Oh, yeah, and they can be delivered in both circular and straight snapping motions.
Got it.
And he covers leg techniques, too,
Right.
really focusing on those denser, bony surfaces of the foot, like the instep,
Yeah.
for maximum impact.
So what are some of the key ones?
So we've got the front snap kick, which is usually aimed at the groin, using the instep of your foot. Then the front stomp kick, where you're driving your leg downwards, striking with your heel, the bottom of your foot.
Mm-hmm.
That one's often aimed at the front of the knee, the side of the knee, the shin, and he says you can even use that to, finish an attacker who's already down. Then there's the side snap kick. You lift your knee, rotate your hip, thrust your leg out to the side, striking with the bottom or side of the foot. Side stomp kick, same idea as the front stomp, but you're directing it downwards and to the side. And then the knee strike.
Oh, yeah, those can be brutal.
Oh, yeah, you're lifting that bent leg and driving your knee into the target.
Hmm.
He also makes the point that a kick is basically an extension of the knee joint. So in close quarters,
Yeah.